who apparently was asked, "Do you believe in Jesus?" And she said yes before she was shot. I remember hearing that story and seeing how it profoundly affected the people around me, how it profoundly affected people at that school. And someone might say, what a terrible tragedy that someone would be killed for their faith. And yet, even though we can't understand it so well, there's something in the midst of that God can say, okay, I'm going to touch millions of people's lives through one person's life. It's because God knows some things about death that we don't. God knows, here's a couple things to write down. He knows that death is not the worst thing in the world. I mean, it's bad. Don't get me wrong. I've never been there. I'm assuming that the getting there is not, the being there is not so bad, but the getting there is bad. I'm not eager to go through the process of getting there. The road trip to death is much less happy than the actual, arrival. But it's not the worst thing in the world. You see, God has this eternal perspective, and he says, okay, so you've got the difference between 35 years or 75 years. Some people die at 35, some people die at 75, some people might die at 100. You've got a difference there of maybe 40 years. In the time span of eternity, that's like nothing. That's like almost absolutely nothing. It's a drop in the nothingness that is the gigantic, it's the universe compared to a pinhead, is what it is. Death is not the worst thing in the world. What happens in eternity could be far worse for you. And then here's the next thing. For the faithful, God knows that a reward lies on the other side. I told Charlie at the beginning of the summer that if he got his times tables memorized, as soon as he did that, he would get a new video game. And for Charlie, memorizing those timetables must feel like death. Because there's this, I don't want to go through that kind of pain. I don't want to work that kind of work, even if it's to get a reward. Well, friends, we're going to get a phenomenal reward. Death is not exactly the worst thing in the world. I'm going to keep on moving, because once we get a perspective on that, then the rest of the seals kind of happen pretty quickly. Seal 6A, I divided it into two, is a global natural disaster. You see the description there? There's a terrible earthquake. Terrible earthquake. The sun turns black. The moon turns red. The stars in the sky fall to earth. This is the kind of thing that would happen if a supervolcano were to explode. In fact, the United States holds the world's largest supervolcano. It's in the northwest corner of the United States, centered underneath Yellowstone. And the last time it erupted, geologists have estimated to be about 640,000 years ago. And the previous eruption was about 660,000 years before that. And the previous eruption was about 800,000 years before that. So it's on like a 700,000 year timetable. You might be thinking, okay, that means we're about 100,000 years away. Or you might be thinking we're 6/7 of the way there. Or you might be thinking it could happen at any time. I don't know. But the point is that this passage says something like that is going to happen. It will be disastrous. And look at the response that people have. See, in verse 16, we get to hear the heart of the people on the earth. They called to the mountains and the rocks, fall on us and hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of their wrath has come, and who can stand? All of this stuff has culminated into seal 6. We'll see that in the trumpets. We'll see it in the bowls too. But all of the seals culminate into 6. Number 6 is the culmination point. And that's where the big thing really happens. And here, when the big thing happens, some dramatic natural disaster happens. And on top of it, the people on the earth look to the dirt for their salvation. They say, what are we going to do now that the earth is crumbling around us? Now that everything's going to happen like this? We know this must be God punishing us. We know that God's wrath is coming onto us. So let's look to the dirt. Let's hide in caves. Let's call on mountains to fall down onto us and to hide us from the wrath of the Lamb. And this is the deal. The question is, if judgment comes, are you going to be safe? Who is going to be safe? How do we get to be safe? And here we find that the entire world, all these people on the earth, think they can be safe by looking to dirt instead of looking to God. They could have just said, God, we're sorry. May your wrath move on. May your wrath be appeased. Would you forgive me? But no, they don't. They look to the dirt for salvation. They say, maybe if we could just hide, we'll be okay. But the question remains there at the very end. These people from the earth say the question that should be on all of our hearts. Who can stand? Who can survive this? Well, of course, there's an answer. If you read just a few more pages, as we did in chapter 7, you will find the answer, because in 6b, God seals his followers. I'm way out of time this morning, so I don't have a lot of opportunity to go into detail here, but I'm just going to identify something for you. God calls out 144,000 of his followers, and he puts a mark on them. And we'll find out later on in Revelation that that mark identifies them as God's and serves as a protection so that when the wrath comes later on, it bypasses them. When the great plagues come later on, it bypasses them, even as God bypassed the people of Israel way long ago in the time of the Exodus. They put blood on the top of the doors and on the sides of the doors, and the angel of death, when it passed through Egypt, passed by them. God is going to mark his followers the same way. Well, there are 12,000 from these tribes of Israel, and none of us are Jewish people. Maybe we need to understand what that really means. And so I'm just going to show you something real quick. In verse 7, he sees, in chapter 7, verse 1, he sees something. Verse 2, he sees something. And then in verse 4, you'll notice something. Then I heard, and then look down at verse 9. After this, I looked, and there before me was a great multitude that no one could count. Without getting into all the details, what I have to say is that John hears something symbolic being declared from the angels. And then when he looks, just like every other time in the book of Revelation, he hears and then he looks. He hears and then he looks. He hears the thing said that's symbolic, and then he looks and he sees a vision of an uncountable number of people from every tribe and nation and language. And he sees them there singing praise and honor and glory to God. And we need to recognize that the symbolic 144,000 is really God saying, I have perfected my family the way I wanted to build it from the very beginning. I promised Abraham I would build a family. Now I've built a family. It is perfect. It can't get any better. 12 is my favorite